Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to the OddjobPod as we head underwater for a thrilling adventure. We recycle all the greatest hits from James Bond, and it's only 4 films into the franchise. Yes, we have reached the Connery Appreciation series with Thunderball, or as I like to call it, the Great Rights Shark, of which I'm sure we will get into later when we start talking about the mess that it started causing in terms of Never Say Never Again and beyond there. Because, hey, you've come here to listen to a podcast about a film, and we're probably going to go in depth into legal battles between Hollywood moguls. But that's what you come here for, and that's what you listen to us. Aren't I right? Graham Sibley and Terry DeFallon.
Yeah, well, sometimes you're right. Sometimes you're a bit mistaken. But, it's strange times we're living in.
It is indeed strange times. Yes, indeed. I'm looking forward to getting down and legal, with Thunderball.
Yes,
or illegal, or probably illegal, or borderline abusive.
That would probably be for your eyes only. Gentlemen, we obviously have just come off the biggest highs that we can have from Russia with Love. Widely acknowledged by this podcast, at least, or other podcasts may have different opinions. They're probably wrong. That From Russia with Love, greatest Bond film ever, and then Goldfinger, which is obviously a wonderful entry into the canon. And Graham, then you come to Thunderball. Is this an anticlimax, or is it just unfortunate that it comes after a couple of incredibly strong films?
That is the real question about Thunderball, isn't it? And I think it sits on the shoulders of Goldfinger. You can tell it does, and you can tell it was a film that came out afterwards and was meant to be a follow-up to it. How successfully it does that, I think we're going to go over during this whole podcast, and I think we're going to keep on referring back to Goldfinger and From Russian with Love throughout it. Because that's what the viewers of the film would have done. They would have got into that with huge anticipation. This film would have been. They wouldn't have cared about the whole legal wrangles and everything. All they would have seen is the posters, the beautiful women, Sean Connery, and thought, great, I got another 2 hours of the stuff that I got in Goldfinger. And well, whether or not you prefer your Bond to be like Goldfinger, or whether you prefer it to be like From Russia with Love, this film is not like that. There's lots of things about this. There's lots of good, strong Bond in this film, but it's perhaps not the best put together film. It's interesting in ways, and some bits are just dull, but overall, it's not a terrible film. We know terrible Bond when we see it. This is not terrible. But there are things about it that don't sit well, aren't engaging, and are just confusing at points as well, I think. So yeah, it's an interesting mix, but I think there's so much in the background of it. It's no wonder that it doesn't come across as well as the previous 2 films did.
Well, Terry, it's certainly a film that, as Graham said, audiences certainly didn't mind, because until Skyfall came along, found it was the highest grossing Bond film. It was a film that apparently movie theatres were open through the night to accommodate demand for it, which probably shows you how good and successful Goldfinger was. But then also, I would imagine that if you were a kind of teenage boy who just seen Goldfinger and you saw Thunderball, you're like, wow, James Bond underwater, this is going to be amazing. You can see why audiences would have flocked to Thunderball, potentially in the same way that audiences flocked to Spectre off the back of Skyfall.
Yeah, exactly. I think you kind of answered the question yourself. It is a reflection on the success of Goldfinger that there was just so much anticipation, because people were understandably and correctly thinking that they were going to get much more of the same from Thunderball, and in very many significant ways they do get more of the same from Thunderball. The difference is that the movie doesn't have Thunderball doesn't have Goldfinger's charm. It lacks Goldfinger's humour. And the plot is not as tight, not as well put together as Goldfinger's. One of the big criticisms of Goldfinger's plot is that actually James Bond is a little bit too passive in that movie. Well, maybe there's an argument to say that that's how it should be, because it's one of the best James Bond films ever made. And that can't be said of Thunderball. But I do feel that it was a movie that's got even more budget, allowed itself to be even more ambitious, quite rightly so. Ken Adam not quite got his underground volcano, but you could definitely tell he's getting there. But maybe became a little bit too top heavy with its ambitious sets and production values and special effects, physical effects as they are, and locations, and that maybe that affects the movie's pace, but shouldn't and doesn't affect the charm and the humor and the snappy dialogue of the movie that is of its predecessor, which is largely missing in Thunderball.
So essentially what you're saying is it's lost its charm.
Not very much from where I'm standing. Yes.
Graham, let's sort of ask the question outright, because we've mentioned Thunderball and we've referred to it a lot, and it generally is accompanied by a bit of a sigh. And you kind of you alluded to it in your first answer. So let's put this on the table. Is Thunderball actually a bad film?
It's not a film I choose to watch. I've watched it twice now in the last year, and both occasions were because, one occasion was for this conversation, and the previous was because I was doing a complete watch through. So I felt compelled to watch it. It's not a film I pick off the shelf, which is always a sign for me that it's not a Bond film that I think personally is one I enjoy. So does that mean it's not good? Well, for me, yes, I guess it does. But there are worse films. There are worse Bond films in the franchise. Yeah, this doesn't exist in the top 10 as far as I'm concerned. This doesn't exist in the top 15 as far as I'm concerned. But then again, I think very few Bond films are actually bad. So it's on the cusp. It could easily be bad.
Mm.
But there are things in it that I just think are bad. But as a whole, no, there's far too many things in it that are good Bond for me, that save it, that actually thinks, yeah, actually I really enjoy this, or bits that have been taken and pastiched and parodied as well, which is something we go back to a lot, don't we? Which do make me laugh, do have that little bit of humour. But Terry's right, the script itself has pretty much zero humour in it as well. So that really means for me that it sits lower down in the rankings. Whether that makes it bad, I don't know. It's personal taste, isn't it?
Do you think it's because already you could, I mean, from my perspective, I could see it, they're already starting to recycle a lot of the ideas and tropes and kind of cues and even plot lines and elements of that Bond does quite frequently, but this is the fourth film in the franchise and they're already harking back to some bits that they've done before?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess by the time you're four films in, things are going to start getting to be a bit repetitive. But then you do see developments, like with Q. So you see that we've seen Q develop as a character throughout the three films that he's been in, and he gets a lovely little cameo in this, and that is something that goes on throughout the films. Because this is the fourth film. And I think a lot of our conversation about the last one, about Goldfinger, about it set in the mould, and also as well what you said about this one being so incredibly popular, was the fact that, okay, we've got our franchise now, let's do it. Let's just give people what they want over and over again. And of course, you're going to get that with using the same people, bringing them back, or mixing and matching people, but having a core there of the same sort of production staff. But of course, in this one, you have a different producer, don't you? And I think that's one thing that Thunderball does have, is it does have quite a few tropes in there that it introduces as well that are carried through in the the films and also in the parodies and the pastiches as well that follow. So yeah, it does have the tropes, but I think that's because it is now in the groove. We're now in the groove of what a Bond film is. We know what to expect. We all the way through, and so I think there are tropes in this, but then it is now part of the franchise, isn't it? It's not just a couple of films at the beginning which are finding their way. This is where we are in the groove on a lot of things. Well, people like John Barry are in the groove. Ken Adam is building up his groove quite substantially. And we've got Sean Connery, who is extremely comfortable in his role now. Perhaps a little too comfortable.
Yes, to the point of there are points where Sean, God rest his soul, does look a little too relaxed, shall we say, on screen. Terry, I mean, Graham's kind of said that, they're into their groove into here. One small thing that's kind of interesting at any rate is that this is not a Guy Hamilton film. This is back to Terence Young, who did the first two. There is part of me that wonders, given just how well Hamilton had nailed Goldfinger, how it would have been had he also been actually decided to take up on Thunderball, although he also made Diamonds Are Forever as well. So, it could have gone either way.
Diamonds Are Forever is a few years down the line, isn't it? And at which point I think we're probably thinking the franchise is probably a little bloated and having lost some direction, having lost its main lead and having to recast the character with a new actor. So I think we can give Guy Hamilton something of a pass for that. I think that it's impossible to say, isn't it? It's a sliding doors thing, isn't it? But I think that it's reasonable to assume that the director of Goldfinger, had he had a chance to direct Thunderball, would have tightened that movie up quite a lot. I think a few sequences might have been shortened, and there may have been some different choices. Some of the action sequences in this movie are just simply below par, and they just do not hold up. They're just not good. That they were probably okay and acceptable at the time. But they just simply do not hold up now, and particularly at the very end of the movie. At the very end of the movie, I'm not talking about the underwater fight sequence, which is amazing, but the boat chase at the end is silly and unconvincing, and checks me out of the movie every single time. Which is just as well because it's about to end, so it's a good time for me to be checked out of the film. But I mean, and I don't think Guy Hamilton would have been able to have done anything about that because those were in the script and that was what was going to be happening. He might have handled it differently, but I think it's reasonable to assume that the film would have been a little better with Guy Hamilton. But I mean, it is worth bearing in mind again. I mean, we're not talking cigarette papers here, but to answer the earlier question, this is not an objectively badly made film, apart from the badly made bits that I've just referred to. It's a good James Bond adventure. It is also, you could probably say, it's the first James Bond adventure in that it is the first film in which they go, right, we now have the established template of a James Bond film, and we're going to deploy it ruthlessly for the next 10 movies. Starting with this one. And that's perhaps where it shows. It is difficult to watch this movie from an entirely fresh perspective. Of the ones that I've seen so far, this was the hardest movie to watch from a fresh perspective, as though I had never seen it before.
Graham, I think, is it fair to say that this is a movie that could have done with better editing?
Certainly. I know Peter Hunt has gone on record to say that he was rushed with the editing, and in fact the film was released 3 months later than it was scheduled to be released. I think it was due to be released in the September of '65 rather than the December. But it looks rushed, and there are things in there directorially that just don't give the editor any help either. I think. I think as well, a lot of the action sequences, and there's a hell of a lot of undercranking in this, and we expect that a lot in 60s Bond films, but in this one it's just used over and over again. Yeah, you could say about the editing is bad in this, but I think it's let down by the screenplay. And also the fact that some of the action sequences in there just don't convey a lot of action in them. The screenplay for me has too many bits in it where it's relying on little snippets of information thrown in to keep you up to speed as to what's going on. Like or little visual cues like the little tattoo on the hand to try and keep you going and say, oh, that's him doing this, and that's why Bond can justify putting the broom handle through the handles of his sweatbox. And a lot of the time there is the thing of, well, that's just a bunch of stuff that happens. I think like that scene is most memorable for me is perhaps when that car chase where Bond, where you think it's going to become just like a regular car chase, black car zooms up behind him and he's got a gun and he's going to try and shoot Bond through his bulletproof car, and okay, and but then all of a sudden that changes, it twists because you got the motorbike comes along and shoots it off the road. It was for ages for me that I thought, what's actually gone on there? Why is this happened? And it's just like little tiny throwaway lines that build up to it that you only really get on second viewing. And I wonder if you were just someone in the cinema, you just watched it and just let it flow over you. Oh, this is just Bond stuff. We'll find out what happens about that. But it's just little things like that seem to pile up in this film. There's lots of things like that of situations where they are meant to weave intrigue, but in the end you just don't care about them because you don't instantly think, oh, I wonder what's going on there. Oh, yeah, this is really dragging me into this massive web. You're just thinking, oh right, well that's happening. I don't really know what's going on there, but it may be important, but I doubt it is.
Yeah, I mean, Terry, Graham's kind of touched on a bit there that it was rushed. Or certainly bits of the film were rushed through. Part of me was wondering, and I think this is very much in your area, how much this might have been in connection with the fact that 9 months earlier, you had a very intriguing film, or a film that is full of intrigue, in the Ipcris Files, which coincidentally actually had the same editor and some of the same producers on board. And after, 3 Bonds, you've then got the Ipcris Files, which sandwiches Goldfinger and Thunderball. And we've seen Bond kind of react or move around some other cultural moments or films that have had cultural resonance within there. And there's part of me that's wondering how much is this playing on the minds of people who are trying to get the film to market potentially a little bit quicker than it needed to be.
Interesting. I mean, they're both spy movies, and they're both obviously, as you say, have a huge crossover, not least of which is Harry Saltzman. But they are, for me, they're going for 2 quite different markets. Thunderball is going for the same market of the Ipcris File, because Thunderball is going for all the markets. It wants all the adults. It wants them all. It wants everybody alive to watch this film. Ipcris File knows that probably this is going to be watched by a certain market, a certain demo, to use that hideous term, and pitches itself accordingly. The question you asked me, it's never occurred to me that at all, and I can't really see any kind of correlation. I don't think that Thunderball would have felt threatened by the Ipcris File. I think it's possible it might have felt informed a bit and gone, well, it's interesting, the reaction that we got from this movie. Maybe they like things to be downplayed a little bit more. I wonder whether or not the development of Fiona Volpe might have had some genesis from the Ipcris File, because Jean's character, albeit very brief, is quite strong and independent and ambiguous as well in that film. And maybe they might have seen the reaction for that and gone, oh, maybe we should try and boost a female character who is a bit strong, albeit a femme fatale and a bad guy, but a bit stronger. I mean, she's brilliant in this, and also she helps to introduce what the rare surprises that are in this movie, or would have been surprises in this movie, because when Bond because there is a moment when it does appear that the film is trying to convince the audience that Bond has seduced Fiona and converted her. And that doesn't appear to be the case. And I would suggest that perhaps contemporary audiences might have been a bit surprised by that, because in the previous film that trick worked, that tactic worked. Bond converted Pussy Galore in more ways than one, on more than one level. Amazingly, astonishingly, really. But indeed, when she turns up on the motorbike to completely ruin what was shaping up to be a really, really good Aston Martin chase. I wonder how that went down as well on in front of that. So that's an interesting thing, but I can't really see any kind of connection with the Ipcress file. But I'm always delighted to have the opportunity to talk about the Ipcress file, because it's my favourite film.
It seems like it was, again, too good an opportunity to pass up to let you at least throw in an Ipcress file question. But in terms of the Graham, just sticking with the kind of intrigue in there, we talk a lot about what type of Bond film it is from the start, and there's a lot that you do have to wrap your head around in there. And again, part of me is wondering that you have got this other spy film that's there, and we know how much Bond does kind of borrow. And I just wonder if as somebody like Andy Townsend might say, they've intrigued it a little bit too well.
If anything, Clive.
If anything, Clive. He's intrigued that a little too well.
Well, yeah. I mean, I must say, Bob Simmons has wonderful pins, doesn't he? That's one thing we learn from the opening sequence, isn't it?
Better than Charles Gray, at any rate.
And of course, this is of course where we get the Austin Powers buzzer out, isn't it? Because that's a man, baby.
Austin, that's my mother.
Which is entirely based on this scene, isn't it? It's fantastic. But yeah, ridiculous. The fact that he beats him back. Not only does he beat him back to his house, but he manages to squirrel away a jetpack for him to make his escape for the 200 feet to where his car is.
On the roof of his house as well. He gets back to the roof of that guy's house and then goes up there with his jetpack, stashes it there, comes back down again.
It's almost like the effort, if somebody went to the effort of, I don't know, like putting a coffin in a gondola in Venice and getting somebody to throw a knife at them and then trying to shoot them.
It's bloody close. It's bloody, and as well, I love the way that they very neatly put the jet back in the back of the car. No, we're not going to leave this here.
I mean, it's an expensive piece of kit, and it doesn't belong to them, apart from everything else. I've got no problem with that, by the way. Absolutely no problem with that. It's a good scene. It's a very, very enjoyable scene, and
it's a very enjoyable scene. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. I mean, I love the movies where they steal rocket fuel laden space shuttles off the back of jumbo jets. I'm all on board with that. All on board with that. So I mean, that's good. I mean, that's another example, I think, of how the movie, despite the fact that it's got all of its trope ducks in a row, is trying to tweak it slightly to surprise the audience, to say, look, this is just like the last James Bond film, but we're going to throw a couple of curveballs your way just to surprise you. We'll deny you that DB5 chase. James Bond doesn't convert the bad girl. And that old woman over there is in fact a man, baby.
Terry, where do you go from here? Number two. Terry, I was also wondering as well, because this was, from my understanding of Thunderball anyway, this was a book if you will, or that actually started as a screenplay and actually was the genesis of much of the legal wrangling that followed with and that culminated in Never Say Never Again. But how much do you think this kind of shows that, unlike Dr. No and From Russia with Love and Goldfinger, which were adapted from the source, this film is one that was intended as a screenplay and then became a book and then made it back to the screen again? And I don't know about you, but it kind of does feel like there are elements in here that do feel broad brush that you can see how this film has come into Genesis in a slightly different way to its predecessors.
It's an interesting sort of like clash, really, isn't it? Because it was clear. It was, if I'm remembering the timeline correctly, it's like, I've written these James Bond books. They're really popular. I'd like to write a screen treatment. I'll hang out with this geezer. I think he wrote it with McClory, I think, didn't he? The screen treatment, and then he adapted it as a novel when the movie didn't materialize. Only for it then to be adapted. So it feels like it's a sort of second or third generation VHS copy. Looks like it at times as well. And maybe there's some inherent problems there in that it's lost something in its subsequent transfer. That doesn't make any sense to me. I think it is worth bearing in mind that the genre of high production value, high quality action movies is really young at this point. There aren't many of these kind of movies around. They make big action movies a lot nowadays and have done for decades. This was one of the not one of the originals, but among the first. I mean, going back to sort of like, Hitchcock's kind of North by Northwest and stuff like that. And these kind of movies, there's an awful lot of moving parts to it. It's technically, they're hard to make. And it was very ambitious. And I think that's probably at the heart of the difficulties, most of the difficulties with this movie, rather than anything to do with the original source material. I mean, the book is an enjoyable read, and if I remember rightly, I don't think it deviates horrifically too much, as you would expect. But it is very filmic, and it is ironic that the story that was conceived to be a movie actually has turned out to be one of the less remarkable of the James Bond movies.
Graham, you do wonder that if Fleming had known, and probably if Broccoli and Saltzman had known what was going to come from Thunderball and the original McClory script, whether they would have just gone, maybe we might just pass on this one, eh?
Yeah, there is this whole feeling of obligation about the film, isn't there? And Terry's right. The action genre is largely, wouldn't say it's in its infancy, but it's certainly in a pivotal moment, because during the 60s, most what we would call action films were war films. So highly militaristic, and you get a lot of that in Thunderball. There's lots of familiar cues in there that you will see in war films. I think it's too many cooks on this, or there's too many rewrites in this, and this is obviously an inherent problem where you've got lots of writers who bring ideas to a story and think like this is the most important aspect of this story. And I think that's what is one killer thing about Thunderball. You don't really get what is the most important thing about this. Is it just James Bond finding a couple of nuclear weapons? Okay, that's a good story. There are so many characters in this that you don't really get any sort of sympathy for them, I think, or you don't identify with any of their characters in them, which, considering what you had in the previous film with complex characters like Goldfinger and Pussy Galore, who in the film is perhaps more complex than she is in the book. I think you are missing something with this. The fact that it's not been reimagined, it's just been rewritten for the screen, and I think maybe that is where the problems arise. But I think it's more the case that it's a different boss in charge of this one, and I think it's just that leadership there from McClory in this leads this film, even though it's got all the same production team and the same and the same cast, leads it into a different direction, and it leads it slightly away from where we've gone in the previous films.
I mean, Terry, we've done a podcast on Never Say Never Again, which I think we all probably enjoyed more than we thought we had. Was that the film that should have been made, potentially?
Yeah, Never Say Never Again is a better film. Not necessarily because technically it's better. I mean, you can make relative comparisons with those movies on a technical basis and still determine whether you think a movie is better made. I think that Never Say Never Again, for its 80s level of sort of technical ability plus its relatively modest budget, I think, aside from a few dodgy horse moments, it is a very, very good, engaging action film. And there's just so much effervescence to the characters as well. I mean, I think Largo, is probably the one that sticks out. I mean, Klaus Maria Brandauer's Maximilian Largo is just a force of nature, is a joy to watch, captivates the screen. And the moments that he enjoys with Connery are just fantastic. Emile Largo, Adolfo Celli, is a fantastic actor, and I really like Emilio Largo. I think I may have batted for him during the World Cup of Bond villains. I can't remember, but he is denied his proper place, I think, in this movie, and it's not the actor's fault. And he does his absolute best. Him and the voiceover actors as well, Robert Wrighty, who must be acknowledged as well, had done their absolute best. And the moments between him and Connery are some of the highlights of the movie, but they are incredibly rare. And there's, it's another error of judgment in this movie is that the relationship between the chief villain and James Bond is not sufficiently exploited. I like to think they probably learned lessons from that, because it is very clear to me.
And so, Graham, there's one thing that seems to come into my head from the last few sort of minutes of chat that we've had, which is that Thunderball isn't a bad film, but it commits almost what is a cardinal sin in the James Bond world, in that it's a little bit dull.
Yeah, and I think it goes back into that whole thing of what I said before about the fact is you don't care about what happens, and I think as soon as you check out of events in a film, or as soon as they don't hold any meaning for you, or you don't choose to give them any meaning, then that's when the dullness arrives. And of course, there are protracted sequences in this film that are meant to be action-packed, but just go on for far too long. That's not the reason that this is dull. The reason this is dull is because for large parts of it, you don't care about the people involved in it.
And Terry, that's a bit of a shame as well, especially when you look at the cast and the lead actors as well, who are all incredibly engaging. Somehow you've got a film which is just a little less than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, no question. I think that for me, the best example of that is the carnival chase, which, I mean, if you hold that up against a similar pursuit that goes on in On Her Majesty's Secret Service when Bond escapes from Pete's Gloria, when he retreats down to the Christmas festivities, and there's genuine tension in that in that sequence, whereas there's none whatsoever in Thunderball. And a lot of it is obviously, unfortunately, direction, bluntly, and probably editing as well, just film craft, and just one is better done than the other. But a lot of it, I think, also at this point is there doesn't seem to be. I don't, as an audience member, I don't really feel engaged with any of these characters, including James Bond, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't. I think that Sean Connery obviously he's a brilliant actor, and he has some great moments in this movie. Because there's no life to this script, it's very, very difficult to sort of feel engaged. And he's James Bond. I mean, what's going to happen? What's the worst that's going to happen? It's really more of a question of how does he get out of this one rather than will he get out of this one? And then ultimately the answer to the question is, I don't really care. As Graham says, how he gets out of this one, I just know that he will. And obviously, having seen it multiple times, we know what's going on. And there's not much there to sort of like celebrate, in that scene. I mean, that whole portion of the film is just draws out. I mean, it happens actually in the space of a few short hours. He takes Domino to the Junkanoo, and then he leaves, goes, has a fight with some guys at Largo's place, escapes the sharks, comes back, sleeps with Fiona, goes back to the carnival, kills Fiona, and then, and all of this, there's an awful lot going on there in what's actually supposed to be a relatively short space of time. And it just doesn't sit well. I mean, it's just not terribly convincing. And as Graham points out, the undercranking in this film and the green screening is really, really toe curling, difficult to watch. And I'm not even certain that I would have had that in the 1960s. I mean, that would have just looked like a Keystone Cops film to me.
Graham, one of the things, and this is a question that or a point that I will raise, and I think I consistently raise throughout the podcast as well, which is imagine another Bond in there. But I felt watching Thunderball again just how much I was missing Roger. And I think this would have been a much better film potentially with Roger Moore in, because Thunderball there's very little levity and humour in there. And much as I love Connery and still probably prefer Connery as a Bond to Moore, this is one film that really, really needs that lightness of touch that somebody like Moore would potentially bring to a film like this.
Yeah, I would say so. He's certainly the lightest of touches as far as the Bond is concerned, and you want to feel like there is a good film trying to get out of Thunderball, and so it does lend itself to recasting in certain positions, but I still come back to the fact that you don't care about anyone else, and maybe there would have been a different interaction between him and other cast members. When I think about Moore in Thunderball, I try to think, well, what would that make this more like? And would this make it, and I think it would make it probably more like For Your Eyes Only, in that sort of level. If you're saying what's Moore's equivalent of Thunderball, that's what I would say is there. But I think For Your Eyes Only is a much better film. And, that's not one of the greatest ones out there. Would he have brought a bit more humour? Yes, but then we would have needed more script changes to accommodate it. And man alive, I think this already had too many already, don't you think?
The scenes with Moneypenny, the scenes in the absolutely beautifully wonderful conference room, that completely unnecessarily ostentatious conference room, which is just a triumph of Ken Adam, absolutely gorgeous. But I mean, really, like completely unnecessary conference room, and the high chairs and high back chairs. And the moju of that scene is that 30-foot screen, that 30-foot panel that pulls up to go for them to say, well, we haven't got a bloody clue. It could be anywhere here. Map of half the world. It could be anywhere here. And then it just goes again. It's so extravagant. It's ostentatious. It's brilliant. It is brilliant, and it's signature classic Bond, and is one of the great moments of the movie.
That is by no way a negative of this film. It is a big tick from me.
One of my favourite lines from the movie, and it gives you an indication of just how sparse they are, is when, obviously, because Bond is late, turns up late, and then, and Ben's just saying, now that we're all here, and Connery's, Bond's just like pause as he's taking a seat, going, knowing that the rebuke is aimed at him. And I really like that, and I think that Roger would have also relished in that moment. I think the byplay with Moneypenny, of course, would have relished it. I think that Roger would have been absolutely fine in this film. No problem. I doubt he would have necessarily improved it, though. But I think he would have been absolutely fine in this film.
It almost made me feel a little bit, if I compared it to another film, is potentially something like, I think it is before people sort of leap on me, I think it is a better film than Tomorrow Never Dies, but I see it in a kind of similar vein, that there is potentially a good film in there. There's just something not quite right together in there. And again, this is actually a film where I could probably see some of Pierce Brosnan doing a very, very good job through this one as well. There's enough stuff that you can go, somebody different working with it could, and different elements in there could have produced a cracker. It's not dreadful, but it's frustrating. How did you feel? Because the more we've talked about this, the more I'm frustrated that I think that this could have been a film that could have easily been up there with the best. But there's one or two choices, and there's a few elements in there, and it's not ostensibly bad. There's just too many things that aren't quite on a hitting top notes. It's kind of like watching a kind of, I don't know, a mid-table Premier League side that you know kind of where it's going, and you're just frustrated because if they just invested in a better full-back and holding midfielder and a good striker, they might have a full team.
It's like you're saying that Thunderball is a James Bond film that Roy Hodgson would have made. Is that what you're saying, Gareth?
I would have loved to see Roy Hodgson with a cameo as M. I think Roy Hodgson would have made a fantastic M.
I can't disagree with that. Yeah, I mean, some of those sequences needed tightening up. They went to an awful lot of trouble to film the underwater sequences, and they wanted to make the most of them, and they forgot that actually they also needed to make a watchable film. You made a comparison with Tomorrow Never Dies, and I'm not going to argue your point. But what I am going to say about Tomorrow Never Dies is that movie rattles through with really nicely. It's got a good pace to it, and it's got a good level of humour going on there as well. Many films about that, many aspects of that film that are not enjoyable, but I will watch Tomorrow Never Dies over Thunderball any day of the week. Any day of the week.
Yeah.
Is that a hill you are willing to die on?
No, absolutely. There are other hills, and that is not one of them. And I'm certainly not going to go into a death match, between Thunderball and Tomorrow Never Dies. I will acknowledge any argument that says that Thunderball is a better movie. But my personal preference is that I prefer that Tomorrow Never Dies is a more watchable film, and this is because Thunderball is slow. It drags out. Also, it's like there's a part in the movie where they're spending an awful lot of time in a helicopter going around islands, like looking for this Vulcan bomber, and which they eventually find. But the sequencing is wrong. I mean, like they do a transition to another scene, and it's the same scene. They're just back. It's like, okay, we can't find it. Let's go home and come back. Cut to new scene. Oh, it's the helicopter. It's like, okay, so this is you just coming back. I mean, it's like something out of a Batman thing. I mean, it's just, they might have it would have been, more, interesting. But in fact, Batman wouldn't have done that. That's just bad sort of like transitioning. It's bad screenwriting, unfortunately.
You would have had Alfred in the cave doing it.
Yes. Yeah.
Master Bruce.
It just gets bogged down because we know where we're going here, but they feel as if they have to sort of like pad it out, frankly, with stuff, until they finally discover the bomber and then move the story on. It just doesn't move on, in the way as quickly as it should be able to do. And there's an awful lot of going back to places. Let's go back to Lagos. Let's go back to the Disco Volante. Let's have another look here. Let's go. And it's like, well, we've actually been here before. And the underwater sequences, and again, I'm not counting the battle sequence, which is absolutely brilliant, but a lot of the underwater sequences, look at all of this cool stuff we can do with the money that we've got now. We can do big underwater sequences, so let's do them. And it's like, yeah, this is great, but it needs to be 2 minutes shorter. And I don't think that's a modern audience thing. I think maybe a 60s audience is looking at it and going, wow, this is amazing. But I wonder how many people like that movie on a second or third watch.
I think what Terry's described there is that Thunderball is actually like one of those big open world video games that you're not very good at. It's like playing Grand Theft Auto for the first time and just like wandering around a lot. Basically.
Yeah, that is exactly what it's like.
I was feeling that this film is actually, to me, a little bit like, I can imagine if I'd watched it in the 60s, in 65 when it was released, I imagine I would have probably then formed a few years later the similar opinion that I do of Spectre as a film, which was the first time I watched Spectre. It came out and went, wow, I really enjoyed that. That was quite good. And then I watched it again and went, it's got a few good bits in it.
All of the James Bond films are like that. Every James Bond film you go in and watch, it blows you away in the cinema. You come out there and say, that was brilliant. And then if you go and watch it a second time, you go, oh, that's not so good, or that's so good, or actually, oh, God, that is terrible. And, I mean, it was the same with Die Another Day. I mean, I remember Graham and I went to watch Die Another Day together, and we came out and we said it was an absolutely brilliant film. We loved it. We went to the pub afterwards and said how great it was. And then, the next time we saw it, I mean, by the time Graham and I had a conversation about Die Another Day, our opinions had changed quite drastically on the film. But that's what the Bond films are supposed to do. They're created for you to really, even to this day, they're created for you to watch once. Probably because the truth is that the majority of people who watch James Bond films probably do only watch it once. They go to the pictures and see it, and then they're not obsessive like us who sort of hunt it down and record podcasts and try to think about it over and over and over again. And so they can probably there's a lot they can get away with for the sake of theatre and showmanship. And I wouldn't want James Bond films to be made to be rewatched 50 times. I really wouldn't, because they'd be tedious. They'd be constant.
I can testify to that with Die Another Day. I can definitely testify to that with Die Another Day.
Die Another Day. I mean, really, in truth, I mean, I can't speak for Graham, but I should have known better. That film reeked. But I mean, I think I got taken away by Pierce Brosnan's manly chest as he walked into that hotel in where was it, Beijing? I can't remember what, or was it Hong Kong? Hong Kong, wasn't it? I guess I think that first 20 minutes, 30 minutes of Die. I'm sorry, I know we're talking about another movie now, but that whole sequence, the opening 30, 45 minutes of Die Another Day is brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant, and I think I was carrying the sweet memory of that with me when I left the cinema, and then when I watched it again, I thought, oh my God, all of this is awful.
You wouldn't have been the first or the last person to be distracted at some point during Pierce Brosnan's canon.
I'm only human, Gary. I'm flesh and blood.
Graham, just as we I think we've covered a lot in Thunderball, so we'll start starting to wrap up a little bit. But we've had 3 cracking Bond films. We've now got one which we've all agreed is not bad, but it's just a little uneven, slow, lots of missteps in here. This is an interesting point in the Bond franchise as a whole, because it is the point where Connery's starting to potentially check out a little bit. Conversely, it's the point when probably Ken Adam is hitting his stride better than anybody at all in there. But do you think this is a kind of point where you've had Bond that's gone from strength to strength? And we're now at a point where potentially, I don't want to call it ropey Bond, because I don't think that Thunderball is ropey. There's just too many bits that aren't quite right in it. But this is the point where you can suddenly feel, we've had 3 amazing, or one great film to set it up, and then two amazing films. This is the point where we can start to see, we can have bad Bond films as well as good Bond films. Or we can have less than good Bond films.
I think the numbers speak for themselves, and I suppose that's what really leads the progression of the films that follow it. You've got to look, the film was made for $9 million and it made over 140 in return. There's no doubt about it. This is an absolute blockbuster of a film. So the producer would look at that and think, well, what more do we need to put in there? We don't actually need to create good films. We can just go with the formula, and people will turn up, and they did. They turned up over and over again. It is strange. It is, because you think, okay, when's the next good film after this? And you think, well, okay, well, it's got to be on Her Majesty's Secret Service, isn't it? Really, because You Only Live Twice, immensely enjoyable, but there is wrong in lots of places, isn't the best put together film, but does everything that Thunderball does wrong. I think for my money, that's one that manages to hold it together, and because it's got lots of good Bond in it, you will forgive it its weak points. Whereas while this one has got lots of good Bond in it, it's just dull. So, and that's not something you can really say about You Only Live Twice. And we'll go on to that in the next podcast, I'm sure. But On Her Majesty's Secret Service, a good film. Diamonds Are Forever, absolute toilet of a film. And I suppose it alternates, doesn't it, for quite a few films after this, doesn't it? Until, of course, you get to the two Chris Wood films, which are both
brilliant. As has been established. As has been firmly established. There is also
I've had consensus.
There's also some horrific Bond in this film as well. There is the spa sequences and the coercion of a female member of staff is just very, very, very uncomfortable to watch. And I don't think that that's the kind of thing where you can transport yourself back to the mid-60s and say, oh, yeah, no, it was okay to treat women like that back then. That, I think, is one that I think particularly if you were showing this film to somebody who'd never seen a James Bond film before, for that reason alone, I think you wouldn't recommend Thunderball to them. And there's tons of other reasons as well.
And it's, I think we've come to a nice point. I almost feel that the summing up is obviously, as Graham said, wildly popular film, and a film as well that generated an awful lot of money and set the template for what's to come. And yet here we are sitting discussing how it's perhaps not quite all that, and yet it's still, it's certainly held in regard. And when you look at the audiences from the 60s, I feel that there is a wise philosopher by the name of Principal Skinner who said, maybe it's me, I'm out of touch. No, it's everybody. It's everybody who watches a Bond film is wrong, and I'm not wrong at all. That's how I kind of feel now going through this, and it's a shame. I want to like this film. I try, and I don't dislike it. I just don't like it very much. I'm neither overwhelmed or underwhelmed. I'm just whelmed by watching this film.
A lot of people rate this movie highly. To this day, there are Bond aficionados who rate this movie highly, because it does bring a lot. It does. It is the classic James Bond formula. It's got some glorious sequences in it, that particularly in Paris, the Spectre sequence is just gripping. Yeah, it's got all the hallmarks of a classic James Bond movie. It's just, I don't think it's as well put together. And Graham's right. I mean, unfortunately, is a little bit of a trend. I think You Only Live Twice, as we will discover in the next podcast, is an improvement on there. But it still has the same ailments, I think, that come over from Thunderball. But it makes the mistake of picking up the pace somewhat. I mean, even like for Thunderball, even John Barry's soundtrack is this kind of odd hybrid of his sort of like Chris File style mid-60s thing that he's got going on, and then that really tedious leitmotif that just going on and on, refrain that goes on almost all the way through the movie. And it even messes up his own 007 theme. I mean, it doesn't utilize it properly. I mean, it's just off. This movie's just off. The gun sights are off.
I think there's one question which I need to put to both of you where we finished off, and it is a question that is raised throughout the film, which I think we need to answer before we finish, which is, of course, Vargas does not drink, does not smoke, does not make love. What do you do, Vargas? What does Vargas do other than getting a harpoon through the chest?
That is it. That's the only thing he does, and gets out of his chair so that Bond can play cards.
There was a reason why Vargas didn't reply to that question. It's because he's got nothing. He's supposed to be like the henchman of this movie, and he's like completely and utterly nondescript. It's a completely. I mean, he dies well, is all I can say about that.
Let him have an amusing
Vargas defines he defines this film. Basically, got nothing to say, got nothing to do.
Yeah, it's just orders around. So move these bombs over here, move that little submarine thing over here. I'm going to try and kill some. Oh, I failed. It's just nothing going. It adds to the computer. There's a like a blank piece of paper where a lot of characters were supposed to have been written, and it wasn't done, which is odd because there's lots of characters in this film. It's really film. And it's just like so criminal. Also the way that they dealt with Adolfo Celli's character. I thought Largo had so much potential, but. He was a really nasty piece of work, of which there's nothing wrong. A really seriously nasty piece of work, and he dies well. He dies with a harpoon to the back from the woman he's abused for years. It's a good way you want to. But the thing is, he's seedy and filthy, and Goldfinger was a ruthless enemy, but had bags of charm and a degree of fallibility. And Largo is just an arsehole, really nasty piece of work. And you do need a bit of charm about it. The best Bond villains have an element of charm about them, something that you can hang them on. Maybe if all the Bond villains were like Largo, we might have a few less Elon Musks and Jeff Bezoses in the world who clearly grew up loving Bond villains, But because Largo is awful, and that's another thing is you can't get engaged with the villain as well. There has to be an aspect of the villain which you have to like in order for it to be a successful James Bond film, in my view. And then there's nothing about that with Largo at all, sadly.
To the point where even he can't even deliver the line "Rum Collins" with the same panache that Gert Frober delivered "Minced Julep."
Yeah, no, yeah, and it was clearly a nod, wasn't it? It was an attempt to, but it just backfired. What a shame.
There's nothing quite like a mint julep at all. And with that, I think I get the sense, certainly that both of you, Graham, you are itching to discuss You Only Live Twice. So at this point, I feel that we should bid adieu to Thunderball, because we've probably spent more time than the film actually deserves being discussed. How much, Graham, are you looking forward to You Only Live Twice?
Yeah, I am looking forward to it, and I know that this is perhaps the opposite of Thunderball, because although I put it down quite a bit when I rewatched it. I did find that I wasn't disliking it as much as I thought I would. The opposite is generally true of when I watch You Only Live Twice. I look forward to it a lot more than the actual watching it. The actual watching it, I do check out of it a couple of times because there are bits in it. I'm like, oh yeah, there's this bit in it. Oh yeah, I don't really like this bit. But I think it's going to be great to talk about, and I look forward to it. No, listen, listeners, it'll be great, honestly.
and have it had, as Graham has just built that up, Terry. Final word with you. What are you looking forward to as a little bit of a teaser? What are you looking forward to when we discuss You Only Live Twice that is not present in Thunderball?
I'm looking forward to the reintroduction to the proper introduction of Blofeld. I think but Donald Pleasant's portrayal of Blofeld is an absolute highlight. And just in general, I'm just looking forward to sitting down with you chums and maybe cracking open a bottle of Siamese vodka.
I will happily drink to that. And for me, I just happily have a well-edited film with a good script. It's not too much for a man to ask for, is it, at all? Until then, we will put a harpoon to the back of Thunderball and bid you adieu, fair listeners. We are, of course, on all the usual social platforms. Please do subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice. If it allows you to leave a review, please leave a review and say that it's at least more interesting than Thunderball. We hope we have been in there. And if you haven't watched Thunderball, you probably don't need to. Go back to Goldfinger if you're new into Bond and you suddenly delved into this and thought, I know, I'm going to find a James Bond podcast to listen to before I start going into James Bond. and this is the first one you listen to, go back to Goldfinger, go back to From Russia with Love, go ahead to a couple more when we get to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and just generally, you can skip Thunderball. It's fine. It's not that bad. We won't judge you. Until then, good dear listeners, we will be back, and hopefully we shall be a bit more awake for the next one, because hey, it does take that last sequence does take quite a long time to get through. Certainly, probably longer than my outro here. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.